I want to introduce Bob Moore, past president of SEIU Hospital Workers in Baltimore, one of the largest unions in Maryland. And Bob, when I looked up your name on Google, it identified you as a veteran of the civil rights movement. I know that at times you traveled south and worked with Julian Bond and Stokely Carmichael, among others. Could you just tell us a little bit about your background? You were born here in Baltimore, right?
Yeah, I was born in Baltimore. Got involved initially in the civil rights movement around 1962. My heroes were all the SNCC young people who formed Student Nonviolent and CORE and other things. But I got started with the NAACP on demonstrations in front of the gas and electric company. I dropped out of college and went to New York for a while. That's from which I decided after the Sammy Young, I was originally going to try and stay in New York from then on and be able to go to school up there and finish my education.
You mentioned Sammy Young. Tell us a little bit about who Sammy Young was.
Sammy Young is a guy I didn't know. I was kind of in New York and out of the civil rights movement, but there was the Alabama or the Lowndes County Project, which I tried to follow by going past the SNCC office in New York. And Sammy Young was a student at Tuskegee who got shot trying to use a restroom shot, killed. And I come by and find that out one day, and I don't know this guy, but you think the movement would move past. This is after the Voting Rights Act has been passed, and focus seems to be now on organizing, but people building organization. And this guy gets shot just for trying to use the bathroom. Was like we hadn't come any place.
You opened up the first SNCC office in Baltimore in 1968. That was also the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there was, according to the Baltimore Magazine, there was 4 days and 3 days of the most intense riots in the history of the city. Could you go back and tell us a little bit about opening up the SNCC office in Baltimore in 1968 and what kind of difficulties you faced?
I returned from having worked in Alabama for a while. I originally came back in '67 to work on a city council campaign that my friend and mentor Walter Lively was doing. But in the South, we were running out of kind of not guns, but ammunition, because SNCC was under such severe strain, and we all knew that we needed to organize in more than the South and in the North, and so some of us were deciding that we should go back to where we came from and begin building organization, and beginning with the notion that we build united fronts across the black community.
And you were born in Baltimore.
I was born in Baltimore.
So you know that African Americans in Baltimore had twice the national unemployment rate. There was a high rate of infant mortality, and also a legacy of housing discrimination in Baltimore that goes all the way back to the housing covenants of the 1920s and 30s. Could you talk a little bit about that? About what Baltimore was like?
Yes, it was like that exactly.
You realize I had to say that, right? I had to say that.
Exactly like that. Here's a side story. My parents bought a house. Daddy was a steel worker.
Right.
Mom was a stay-at-home.
Steel worker at Bethlehem Steel, I believe.
Bethlehem Steel.
Right.
And
good union man.
Yeah, eventually was a shop steward later on. Anyway, and in my class was a young lady named, it's an elementary school, was named Sandra Banfield. And it is her father, I learned years later, right, who actually broke up some of the covenant where at least blacks could live on the west side of Fulton Avenue, on the east side, I'm sorry, but only whites lived on west side.
Right.
Fulton Avenue.
Right.
And it was her father who actually broke up that by buying a house. So,
Right. When you opened up the SNCC office in Baltimore, was there a unity within the African American community about which way forward?
I think there's always a certain level of unity, but given that Black Power was the message, and the basis of the message was that we need to organize ourselves politically and economically, and to be successful at that, we needed to reach new heights of unity, and that meant trying to build unity across class lines, and so that became the effort. That was the main effort. But in the meantime, there were the I wouldn't call them side issues. There was also hot at the time was H. Rap Brown had been charged with these crimes in Cambridge.
And who was H. Rap Brown?
He was he followed Stokely Carmichael as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And we wanted some demonstrations of support for rap. A hearing was coming up, and we were preparing. And when we heard the news about Dr. King, we had a group of people preparing the last-minute details on the demonstrations. How many people had coming, bus, and
Right.
and what have you. And I had when I opened the SNCC office. I was interviewed by a Sun paper reporter who asked about the relationship between the police and the black community, and I commented that the police act like the enemy of the black community, and a day later, the next morning, the story appears, and Senator Clarence Mitchell, who had been a CIG and NAACP civil rights, got on the floor.
That's an historic name in the black community in
got
Baltimore.
up on the floor of the state senate and denounced me as an outsider and didn't know who it was. And
outside agitator from Baltimore,
in
right?
addition to that, his mother called me a Maoist.
A Maoist.
Right, which...
You weren't a Maoist, were you?
Huh?
You weren't a Maoist, were you?
I don't think so. It's always a possibility. I thought he was a great man. So right off the bat, there's this air of disunity between I'm a militant and this is a moderate, and there's confusion between the groups. We then, when people came to my defense the next day as well and said this kind of stuff had to stop, and echoed the notion that there is the police, are brutalizing people in the black community, and we need to get a handle on that.
So to you, the Freddie Gray rebellions were, the issue of Freddie Gray was nothing new to you in terms of the police treatment of African Americans in the city?
To me and to most people in the black community, it was not news. It's a different kind of era, and obviously it got great national attention, and people were able to talk about the issue for a little while. But I think we're no further along on this issue.
So you were person non grata in terms of the establishment in Maryland in 1968.
You could say that. I also used to have a police detail following me.
So what did Governor Agnew think of you?
Well, Governor Agnew, in his he's famous for having called this meeting of black leaders. I consider myself a pretty big black leader in Baltimore at the time. I didn't get invited, me or my mentor, Walter Lively. We later learned that we didn't get invited because he's referring to Walter and myself. He was referring to me as being a militant who intimidated, responsible for the riot by intimidating the more moderate civil rights leaders. Most of them walked out somewhere along that point.
Now, did this happen before or after the assassination of Dr. King?
This is after. This is the riot.
This is the riot.
The
okay.
riot came,
Right. And they blamed you. In part.
They blame, they didn't specifically call my name out, but they talked about first they blamed Walter Lively. Walter used to get passes doing all the changes because you go from local police to news, state police, National Guard, and they keep changing the rules during the riot. But of course, none of that, neither I nor Walter or any specific person could be pointed to for that. But Agnew was, in some ways, he's making that point. But his main point was that the moderates or the more conservative black leadership was not standing up to the militants.
Bob, we've got about a minute left. Certainly the rebellion in Baltimore in '68 was not unique. It was happening all across the U.S. in major cities. What was the mood or the chance for unity in the African American community after the riots versus what existed before? Was there more or less unity after the assassination of King in '68? Like I said, we've got about a minute left. I'm sorry.
I think that you could view it this way. After the riots, there are all these national and local stories about, well, we need to do more, right, to help end poverty and get people out. Maybe not give them a job, but at least get them out of poverty. And so,
Right.
in that exchange with the powers to be, black folks, many black leaders kind of scattered to do their own little chore. So maybe some were working for poverty programs, blah, blah, blah. So it's a misdirect in many ways, is that because the movement for unity is then dispersed, right, as people do things. Not that they're not doing good things, but they're dispersed and not inclined to do things together.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for your time this morning, and appreciate your time. And I want to say that I really enjoyed this interview. Thank you. You know how to turn it off? I think this is it.
Thank you, Les.